Hello, I'm Diane Mulligan, and I'm a teacher and watercolor artist from Central Massachusetts. In this video, I am going to show you the process that I used to create this little winter landscape using transparent watercolor and focusing on preserving my whites and also thinking a lot about edges. So let's take a look. First, a word about the materials I'm using. So as you can see in the picture, this is in my sketchbook. So this is a very large Hahnemühle Nostalgie sketchbook, which has 100% cotton paper, and it is my favorite sketchbook to use. I am using my travel set of watercolors. For this painting, I only used 5 colors, and that is cerulean blue, quinacridone rose, Hansiella medium, ultramarine, and burnt sienna. And I'm using just 3 brushes. I have a 3/4 inch flat, a size 8 round, and a rigger, a size 4 rigger. Of course, I also have my paper towels and water cup, but the supplies here are very simple for today's painting. All right, let's get started. The photo reference I used for this painting came from a Facebook group called Landscape Reference Photos for Artists, where photographers share photographs and allow artists anywhere to use them for inspiration. In the actual photograph, it appears to be a winter scene, although it could be early spring. The trees are bare, but there's grass on the ground, and it's not actually a snow scene. But what I really liked about the reference photo was the shadows on the house. There were these very dramatic shadows, and it just seemed like a really evocative, interesting moment of light that I wanted to capture. In preparation for the study I just showed you, the winter scene, I did do a monochrome version. And I really love to do these monochrome paintings as preparation for my full color paintings, whether I do it as a quick value study or a more complete painting, which I would say this monochrome is a complete painting of its own. It really helps me to focus on the shapes, the composition design, and to troubleshoot potential problems before I'm dealing with mixing colors. And in working through this monochrome version, the problems that I discovered, the main problem was really a matter of edges. How was I going to get a nice crisp edge on the roof line and around the building without having kind of weird transitions of the background? Because I found when I was a beginning watercolor painter, that was one of the hardest things, was not getting sort of weird directional lines in my background where I had painted around the foreground shapes. So by working in black and white, I was able to come up with a plan. Well, it wasn't black and white. It was Moon Glow, which is a really beautiful purple paint. But in painting in monochrome, I was able to troubleshoot some of those problems and come up with a strategy. And that strategy was to begin the painting wet into wet. And in the video you're about to see, I didn't show you painting clean water on the page. That didn't seem useful. But what I did is I pre-wet every single thing on the page except the parts of the house that are bright white in the sunlight. So the side of that little extension, the gable end of the house, and the side of the chimney. I didn't put any water there, so I kept the dry page, but I wet every single other part of the page so that my initial wash will be really soft and unifying. All right, let's go to the video. Okay, I have sped up the playback here, so this is playing at about double speed, so faster than I actually paint. And you can see that the paper is very wet. And the first thing I do is lay in the sky, which I made a gradient of a pale pink with the quinacridone rose, and then a little buffer layer of very light burnt sienna and the cerulean blue up at the top to try to give a sense of that pale pastel late afternoon winter sky. Once I have that in, I'm going to start to put in my background trees using a gray, very purpley gray, mixed from cerulean blue, quinacridone pink, and a little bit of Hansa yellow. So I'm doing the kind of purpley version for the shadows on the house and the snow shadows, what I'm inventing as snow shadows. And what I really love is the cerulean is granulating. So as the paint lays into the texture of the paper, there's some separation between the pigments and it creates these very lively shadows. All right, so as I said, those background trees, I'm going with gray. I'm aiming for a fairly neutral gray here. And I'm working really fast. I want this to be wet into wet. I want a soft edge at the top of those trees in the background. And I was having a hard time because the room I'm in, the heat was up pretty warm and the paper was drying very fast. So I'm having to work quite quickly. And I'm doing some negative painting going around the house, coming right up to the edge where the paper was wet, being really careful to stop at the edge of the house because I want a hard edge there. This is one of the beauties of this nice flat brush is I can use it at different angles and make those really nice edges. As you can see, I'm changing my mind here. I had been doing some negative painting around the trees. I did change my mind and decide that that mid-tone that I'm putting in will be dark enough for those tree trunks. What I really want is those tree trunks to be lighter than the background behind them, but they still need some color on them. And so my plan here is to put that mid-tone value in, and I'm going to come back later with another layer on the background trees. And just making some adjustments. My initial layer on the far trees I felt went a little too pink, and red is a color that actually makes things seem to come toward you, so I really don't want the distant to have all that pink in it, and I'm gonna have to make a few adjustments there to keep that cool and blue. All right, once I laid all that in, I did have to step away for a while and let the paper completely dry, and now I'm back just working on some of the pieces of the house to get some dimension and shape on there. And for the roof, I'm using burnt sienna and a little touch of ultramarine on this part of the roof, the upper part, where it's a little more shady, and I want to just make that a little darker than the very sunny front roof. For the darker shadows on the house, like the doorways and windows, I'm using a really strong mix of ultramarine and burnt sienna. This is a super classic watercolor mix. It makes a really wonderful and variable gray. You can make it lean more brown or more blue. It almost goes to a really deep purpley shade. And it's a super useful color for shadows, for lively darks, right? We don't want to have any bland, boring darks. And so I'm using that color just to fill in the little details. And I may have rushed a little here, so you'll see I end up having some unintentional bleeds and blooms. But one of the things that I really want to show you with this demo is people often say watercolor is such an unforgiving medium, and I've never felt that way, not even from my beginner days. Maybe partly because we're just working on paper, and if it doesn't go the way I want, I can just do another one. But also, if you are using pigments that are non-staining and you're using good quality paper, you can do some corrections when things go awry. You can't maybe lift back to the white of the page without damaging the page, but you can make adjustments, which is what I've had to do here, right? You can see I had a bloom I didn't want. I dabbed it gently with the tissue to dry it off. I found a number of times throughout this painting that I needed to do a little bit of lifting to just adjust my edges and make corrections. And because all the pigments I'm using are non-staining, I could do that. I'm also using really high quality paper. If you're using inexpensive paper or paper that's not made of cotton, when you try to lift, you might damage the fiber of the paper. Fortunately, this paper can really tolerate a fair amount of scrubbing and lifting. It's one of the reasons I highly recommend 100% cotton paper. And I think the big danger of using those techniques is that you risk kind of overworking it. But in this case, I think it went okay. All right, you can see here I'm now adjusting that background where I said it was too pink. And I'm using, again, my burnt sienna and ultramarine. And I'm doing some more negative painting coming around those tree trunks because they do have a fair amount of light hitting them on the left, and I want to make sure I can keep that. Right, as I mentioned in my planning discussion, one of the hardest parts I find is getting nice edges that seem natural and smooth. So although it looks very fast here in the playback, I was taking my time and trying to be quite careful of how I came around the house. And hopefully you can see there that at the edge, that top edge of the tree line, I'm making sure that I'm getting some variety, a little bit of dry brush, and I'm just sort of kind of softening up and playing with that edge to give it a look of a natural distant tree line. Right, continuing in that same strategy, coming all along here. Unlike in my monochrome piece, I decided to keep the light on these trees as well. So I felt like in the monochrome painting, those trees just went a little too dark, and in reality, there should probably be some light hitting them as well. I thought it would be a nice touch in this painting. All right, so you can see here, I'm adding a little more depth to those doorways with a sense of a shadow. Even though the doorways are very dark, they're not a uniform dark. And so when we're laying down our initial dark tones, it's important not to go too strong too quickly. We can always deepen them, but once we put a really, really dark tone down, no amount of lifting is going to fix it. And here I'm just using a dry brush to put some texture on the sunny side of the house. Even though it isn't a lot of sun, this is an old house. It's got some kind of plaster covering that with lots of texture, and I want to try to convey that here. The top of this chimney also is a really important detail. It's got this interesting chimney cap, so I don't want to forget about that. And I'm in the stage with the house here of really putting in the smaller details, such as the shadow on the roof. That roof shadow is actually very important, so I don't want to forget it. Okay, so you can see here I've got my little mister, and I am spritzing the top of the page very carefully because I want to put in the suggestion of lots of branches, and I don't want to paint a million branches. So I'm using my same burnt sienna and ultramarine, and I have dabbed off my brush so that I have a fairly dry brush, and I'm holding it on its side and sort of kissing the paper with it, just lightly brushing it across the page to get just some texture up there. And because I spritz the page where the page is damp, that dry brush is going to spread out and diffuse, and where the page is dry, it's going to leave a little bit of a harder edge and give a sense of the depth of branches. This is a trick I really love. It does take a lot of practice. This is a great thing to practice on the back of old paintings that didn't work. And you do need a paper with a pretty decent texture. This sketchbook has, it's cold pressed paper, but the texture is still pretty good. All right, now I did save the light on my tree trunks, but the light angle is very strong, so there's going to be a shadow side. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in. You can see I've switched to my round brush, so I'm using a relatively small brush here. And the top is still wet, so as my trunk goes up and turns into branches, some of those are going to spread out into that wet paint, and others, again, will stay with a hard edge. I really like that mix. again, I just want to give a sense of dimensionality of the trees. I personally find that trees are actually very hard to paint, or at least to paint them in a way that I particularly like. It's taken a lot of practice for me to get more confident with trees, and I still learning and still working on growing in this area. I'm happy with how the trees in this one came out. You can see I'm trying to, I'm mostly just putting in like main branches here. When it's time to put really fine branches, I'm going to switch to my smallest brush for those little details. I'm trying really hard to make sure my branches are wiggly and natural. That's my biggest complaint about my own trees. Everything goes too straight. And here I'm just fixing the edge. I want that background to recede a little bit more so that we can really see that light on the tree trunk. And even though we're at the kind of detail stage of this painting, this is the slow part, right? So laying in those big washes, that was pretty fast, but now I have to really take my time and think about, you know, what I'm doing and each step along the way. All right, so I'm just kind of softening and adjusting. I want to get the balance right. Those trees I'm working on now, they're very far in the background. We don't want them to be too detailed, but I do want it to be clear that I have a couple of tree trunks back there. Sorry about my head bobbing into the shot. I'm working with a new camera and I need to dial in my exact camera angle. All right, we're really in the final details here, making some adjustments to values, darkening up the shadow side of that dark chimney cap. And I want to put a little bit of texture on this roof. It's a little tricky. There's a little bit of perspective at play here. And I'm not going to paint every shingle on this roof, but I want to give a sense that there are shingles, that it is kind of a rough texture. And I'm repeating the same thing here because the sun angle is making their shadows appear at those shingles. So we want a little sense of that. Not too much, just a touch. Right? I'm trying not to overdo it or add any details that are going to detract from the work I've already done. Right? Sometimes, and this was a hard thing for me to learn, but sometimes less is more. I also felt I needed to adjust the values on the house shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and you'll see me make those little tweaks here. I really was most drawn to the shadow angles here, so I want those to pop a little bit more. I also, even in my shadows, I want to create some variation and a sense of like a gradient. It's a bit of a visual trick that just adds interest and helps create a sense of depth. Right, but at this stage of the painting, we want to really take our time, think carefully about each change. Right? And here I'm just realizing I didn't really make any kind of edge at the bottom of the shed against the snow. And it is an old house, so there's kind of some coloration on the bottom of those walls. And I think that could really help define this in space. Okay, and still wanting to strengthen up the shadows on the trees to help match in with the intensity of the shadows on the snow and on the house. And just make everything pop a little bit here. I really could not live without that burnt sienna ultramarine combo. I think that every painting that I do has that combo in it. If there were two colors I couldn't possibly remove from my palette, it's probably those. All right, here I have my tiniest little rigger, as you can see, and I'm holding it way back high up on the handle. In fact, you can not even really see where my hand is. It's out of the shot. And I'm doing that because I want the lines to be less controlled. I want to let the brush do the work and make some very natural, fine little tree branches here as some final details to help frame this painting. again, this takes a lot of practice. It's really worth just getting very comfortable with your brushes and your brush strokes. Right, and here you can see I'm just drawing a frame around this in my sketchbook. I don't use tape in this sketchbook. I find that tape tends, no matter what tape I use, it tends to tear the paper. And I'm not good at staying in my lines, but I like a little frame around it at the end so I can get a good view of my painting and see what I've done. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Maybe you'll give this painting a try or give a try to some of the techniques that I showed you. And if you want to learn from me, check out the class offerings at Two Bridges Art Academy. I've got a class coming up in January, and in that you'll get real-time demos instead of these sped up ones, so definitely check it out.